Hello. I can see a couple people starting to roll in. Um, Let me know if for the people on so far, just in the chat, or feel free to go off mute if you can hear me okay. I think some people are perfect. Thanks so much, Stacy. I'll just wait another minute or two. I think we had around 40 people sign up for this session. So just wait a little bit for potentially a couple more to roll in. I mentioned this in the last session, but I know I'm going to be talking a lot during this, but I'd love to see some friendly faces if you guys are willing to go off video, and I'll also try to make this super engaging, or hopefully more engaging than me just speaking at the audience, because I think that's always a little more fun. It's hard to do with Zoom sometimes, but yeah, if you guys are comfortable with it. Hey, Stacy, and hey, I can't actually, Jesse is the other person on video. Cool. Awesome. So before we jump in, I'll just do a quick intro and rundown of how we'll run this. First of all, if you're listening, thank you so much. You bought my book. I'm super thankful for all the support. I launched this really to just like serve a need of my own, which was that I had written or I had done content for a couple years now, both in terms of having a personal blog, but also leading teams in content. And I just felt like there was a lot of misconceptions about how to create content, why you should create content, even the fact that a lot of people create content, and I'm not sure that they should be doing that. And so I really just wanted to deliver what I had learned to a lot of people, and you guys ended up being some of those people. So thanks for joining. I'm Steph. I just quick background, I work full-time at The Hustle, one of the biggest email newsletters in the world, but I also run my own personal blog, and I've just been working in marketing for a while now. But one of the things I love about marketing is that sometimes it gets a bad rep, and sometimes for good reason. There's a lot of black hat tactics in marketing, and I think a lot of people like using hacks and things like that. There's an entire field of growth hacking, which has a lot of merit to it. But I think at the end of the day, marketing and content fits within marketing is all about, serving people and understanding what people want and actually providing them with that. And so that's hopefully what the book does for you guys. And hopefully you guys can do that for other people. So what we'll do in this session is I actually ran a type form when I hadn't gotten a couple hundred sales. I asked those people, for the people trying to, or who want to attend the live sessions, do you want to learn? Do you want this to kind of be like taking the information in the book and delivering it in another form? Do you want to, meet other people, or do you want to do more Q&A? And more than any of the other options, by far was actually just learning. And so we will do Q&A at any point. You can interrupt me. We're a pretty small group here. So if you have questions, just say, hey, Steph, like that didn't make sense. Can you elaborate on that? Or if you're not comfortable going off mute, you can always use the chat. But in addition to that, I'll be going through the information from chapter 1. Hopefully with a couple new examples, a couple more information for those who have actually dove into chapter 1 already. But I think in general, sometimes audio or just a different format makes things more digestible, makes things settle in a little more. So before we do that, I have a couple polls since it's the first session or the first week. So let me launch the first one. And it's just to get a sense of where people are at. So the first one is just to get a sense of like how many people actually, or if you've read the first chapter, if you've managed to skim it, if you've managed to read the summary, if you're joining this because you actually haven't read it and you'd love to learn it, you'd love to learn the content through another form. So take a second to answer that. A poll should show up on your end. All right, so it looks like we've got most of the people who have answered that. So I'll end the poll and share the results. So it looks like it's a totally mixed bag. Looks like actually it's funny, on the last session, most people had read the whole thing, or I think around 50% of people. So this is actually better. So it won't be as repetitive for the people on this call. So I'll stop that. I've got 2 more super quick polls. So the second one is to get a sense of where you're at in what I'm saying is your content journey, which is basically just, have you started a publication? Are you planning to? Have you actually done this for years and you're probably more of an expert than I am, but you're just looking for another perspective or refresh on what you know? So looks like actually these results are very similar to what we saw last time or in the other live session, which is that a lot of people here haven't started yet, which is awesome. I mentioned this on the last session, but I think often when someone is really antiquated in a space, they can forget that, how quickly things can move, and that some of the things that were true 3 years ago or 5 years ago are no longer true. And so coming in with a completely fresh perspective can actually be really valuable. The third one, before we jump in, is just to get a sense of, the book is split up into 5 sections, or I guess 6 I have here, but it's mostly 5. So which one of them are you most struggling with? Or maybe struggling is not the right word for that, but what do you feel like you can get the most value from? We're going to be talking about the first one today. I just want to get a sense of how people are looking at the book and where they think they can get the most value from it. All right, so I'll wait a couple more seconds if people want to enter their answers. All right, so this one was different than the last session in that a lot of people did say that they needed help with positioning last session, but interestingly enough, distribution I think was this equally as much of something that people wanted to learn about. So always interesting to see, but it's a good thing that we're talking about positioning in this group because that's what the first chapter is about. So before we jump in, we did this last session, but I would love, we're a small group, so we can go through as many as we want to or need to, but I'd love to just, hear some of their voices. What's your name? I guess the 3 things that we'll go through if you're willing to participate are, what's your name? Where are you calling in from? This is the second session, so I think some of you might be in Asia or Australia, things like that, which is super cool. And then if you are working on a publication or planning to, what is it? And yeah, just share a little bit more about what you're working on. So we're a small group, and we don't really need to use the raise hand feature or anything like that. So if anyone's willing to share, feel free to go off mute, and yeah, we'll start there.
Hello. Hi, I'm Jesse. I'm connecting in from Basel, Switzerland. So it's middle of the night here. The personal publication is, the publication is my blog, my personal blog. I'm just looking to find a way to have a regular publishing schedule with content that's worth publishing.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining.
Hey, what's up? I'm Nick. Last year, I launched a blog under a pseudonym, and then this year, I decided to just launch it under my real name. And really just, sharing. It's really just sort of like a compliment to everything else going on in my life. It's not like the focus. Yeah, just thought it'd be cool to work in public.
Awesome. Glad to have you.
Hey, I'm Stacy. I'm in Birmingham, Alabama, and I'm working for a startup, an education startup, and we have a blog, and we want to use it productively, fruitfully, and give back to our customers. So that's why I'm here.
Awesome. Thanks, Stacy.
Hey, Steph. I'm Whit. I'm calling in from Portland, Maine. I've been a journalist most of my career, so kind of writing has been, what I've made my living at for a long time. And I've done a newsletter and my own little media publication for the last 5 years, covering startups and tech in my home state of Maine. So, and I do kind of PR marketing consulting now, and my newsletter is just a side hustle. But I've been doing it for a while, but can always use more, fresh perspective. And I have monetized it, but I'm looking at what else I can do, how can I expand it, and I have some other ideas too for additional newsletter ideas and content stuff that just want to explore.
Perfect. So you're one of the people who knows more than I do.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, maybe about journalism, but not necessarily. I mean, I love the hustle and trends, so that stuff is super fresh, and I'm always fascinated by the stuff that I'm reading in that. So I
Awesome.
think we can learn from each other.
Cool. Perfect. Anyone else want to go? We've got time.
I'll go. Hey, I'm Seem. I'm calling in from Sydney in Australia. I haven't really done much writing myself. Always been the type of guy who thinks he's not creative, etc. So I'm sort of just exploring and been following the guys at Visualize Value and been on Twitter recently. So yeah, more just curious. And I do have a personal website with a couple of articles, but it's a mix of like technical IT stuff, which is what I work in, and yeah, like around productivity but just finding my feet in this space really.
Perfect. Kai, I saw you go off mute. You're welcome to go next.
Hi, my name is Kai. I'm in Los Angeles, and I'm in the pre-launch phase of a newsletter called Stephanie Danger, which is geared towards women in midlife and all the shit that goes along with that. So yeah, I'm excited to learn and figure out how to find them. That's my challenge.
Perfect. Anyone else want to go before we jump in?
Yeah, it's Christian here in Melbourne, so for Twinkie. I've started a paid community called storyteller.io. Launched like a week ago softly, got like 10 members from all continents, which is exciting. And I want to build my newsletter, I guess, not newsletter. I just want to tell hardcore stories every day, kind of like a Seinfeld episode. Like I want 3 to 4 stories a day of my life into this platform called Storytime, connected to Storyteller, the paid platform. But I don't want to do a newsletter, and I don't want to do informational or factual content. And I don't want to do mental models. So I want to try and see how I can merge the worlds of hardcore storytelling with value to help people take action. But I don't want to get too technical. Like I don't want to be able to have to research any other thinker ever again in my life to be able to provide value. That's my kind of goal with this blog, I guess.
Very cool. Thanks for sharing. I love that you're calling in from a walk. I feel like we should all do that more often instead of sitting at our desks. Anyone else before we jump in?
Hi everyone, I'm Grace. I'm also joining from Melbourne, Australia. I bought the book and joined because sort of deciding what I want to share online. So I do a bit of career coaching for grads, but also like involved in data science and data visualization. And so, yeah, how do I focus what I talk about, and how do I have sort of that one brand that I have online?
Awesome. Thanks, Grace. I think I might have seen Christian go off mute, but if not, if you didn't want to go, not pressuring you, just wasn't sure. All right, I'll jump in then. So I'll share my screen. I put together some slides, which again, if you've read the content, might be a little repetitive, but I did try to toss in some new examples so that it's not completely a repeat of the book. But I would also say on the flip side, this is a summary, right? Or like if you find any part of this interesting, it may be valuable for you to still dive into the parts of the book and get more depth there. But with that said, we're going to be talking about chapter 1, which is all about kind of defining your publication and what I'm calling your personal monopoly. And this is something that consistently I see people skip over, right? So whether you're a person or a company, I often see people just say, hey, it's time to start a blog, right? I'm just going to start a blog. I'm just going to start writing, start publishing. And they haven't really spent the time identifying what their differentiator is. They vaguely know what things they'll be writing about, but they don't actually think about how they're going to stand out, or actually something that I think is equally important, whether they really should be spending time publishing at all. Because again, I'll talk about this in the presentation a little more. The barrier to entry has decreased so significantly that everyone just feels the need to write online, right? And there's nothing wrong with people writing online, but I just think that in general, you really have to think about, do I have something interesting? Do I have something unique? Do I have something valuable to put out there? And this is kind of that step where you're evaluating that. So in order to really understand where you're going to differentiate, I think it's important to understand the dynamics that influence content online overall. And to do that, we're going to go all the way back. So imagine you're a person in the 1950, before the internet was even even existed. If you wanted to get information or if you wanted to deliver information, there was very few pathways for you to actually do that, right? So there was newspapers, I'm not even sure actually if radio exists. I'm sure it existed at this time, but basically there's very defined, radio channels, radio stations, newspapers. And if you wanted to get information out to people, those were the only ways to do that, right? And because those were the only ways to do that, not only was there only a few ways to reach people, because there's only a few ways, you could only reach people at mass. So you couldn't reach specific groups of people. It was very hard to do that. And it was very based on existing distribution systems that you could not actually manage, right? Or in most cases, you didn't own them. You couldn't necessarily be part of them unless you're, a writer for X newspaper or whatever. But that changed with the internet. And so, we fast forward to, in the 60s, there started to be early rumblings of the internet. In 1989, that's where we started to get the World Wide Web, when really all of a sudden we had the ability to connect someone from Australia to someone, in California, like we're on this call today. That did not exist before, unless you're talking about snail mail, completely different though, right? You didn't have the opportunity to really easily reach people from all over the world. But even then, it took around 5 years for the written word to really start to take form in the form of blogging or writing long form articles. And so Steve Gibson emerged in 1994. He's kind of referenced as the first full-time blogger of, the internet. And then 5 years later, Blogger was formed, which was really the first platform that not only allowed people to write online, but allowed them to do it easily, right? So I'm assuming, I haven't researched this, but I'm assuming Steve Gibson either, created his blog himself, maybe he had a dev team to do that, but Blogger was revolutionary, and it allowed people to do that a little more easily. And then as we get into the 21st century, what I'm calling the internet age here is really when things got completely revolutionized, and it became incredibly easy to put content online. And so in 2003, WordPress was founded. Now WordPress powers over 30% of the internet. In the next decade, you have all these other kind of websites or blog builders that really just completely changed the game in terms of how people could put their thoughts, their information online. And then in the last couple of years, especially, I think sometimes we forget this, how much this is really accelerated in just the last 5 years. So 2016 relative to 2011, there was a 5x increase in the number of WordPress sites that were built. And now that, we find ourselves in 2020, there's already over 1 billion websites that exist, but in Q1 of 2020, over 300 million domain names were registered. So the rate of people actually participating in this kind of digital content space is accelerating over time. And something to keep in mind is we're talking mostly about longer form content when we're talking about newsletters or blogs, but this is true just in general for just putting any information online. And so this is the number of times each of these things happens in a minute. And so, in a minute, 350,000 tweets are sent, hundreds of thousands of emails, millions of Google searches. So it's really insane, just the rate of information that's being posted online. And it's really, what I'm trying to get across here is it's important to know that it's because people can now. The barrier to entry has just completely, vanished, actually. And so if that's true, the question then becomes not what it perhaps used to be, which is how do I actually get my information online? That is very easy now, but it's how do I actually stand out, right? How do I actually now grasp at the attention of now billions of people that you can technically have access to? And so I'll go through 4 what I would say are more of the fundamentals. We'll go into more things after, but the fundamentals of understanding how this internet age changed the way content is distributed and consumed. So we talked a little bit about reduced barriers. I'll talk about that a little more. I'll talk about how you can become an innovator in any particular space and how you can reframe your view on that. I'll talk also about distribution pathways and, again, how the internet completely changed that dynamic. So not just the way that you can put content online, but how the internet has changed how you can actually reach those, the people that you're trying to through the internet. And then finally, the power law. So how the internet completely changed how content or the way that content reaches people. So the distribution of certain articles or certain pieces reaching people, and the disproportionate way that certain people are benefiting and others are not because of the internet. So I'll jump into each of these now. So the first one is, again, this barrier to entry. So what you need to take away from this is just that over time with the internet, the supply and demand of information online has not grown symmetrically. So yes, there has been an increase in demand for people looking for content online, but that has not been symmetric compared to supply. And that is for the reason that I've mentioned, in just that the tools that we have today have completely changed the game in terms of just how easy it is to put content online. And for that reason, you don't need to be a New York Times writer. You don't need to, be trained as a writer. You don't need any of that. Anyone today, as long as you have an internet connection, can put content online. And so that is just increase the supply exponentially. The second thing you need to know, okay, so supply is increased. There's a bunch of people participating. Now, how do I actually out-innovate these people? So something that I think people misunderstand is that, let's imagine, so if you've ever heard of the diffusion of innovation curve, with basically, this is the way that people adopt things, right? And so it starts with innovators, then goes to early adopters, then to early majority, and you really want to get in. This is, the critical mass. But really, you benefit from getting into any industry at this innovator stage, right? Now, if we think about blogging overall, right? There's so many bloggers. If you're just putting content online, you are not an innovator. You're, in fact, probably, in the late majority today, if you're just talking about blogging overall. But every single industry, or even parts of an industry, have their own curve, right? And so you can still be an innovator if you either find an area that is new, so that no one is in currently. But I will caveat that this is the area that people normally try to target. They try to say, let me find an industry or a topic that no one is writing about. And sometimes that can be successful, but again, it's very hard to do because there's so many people writing online. What are the chances that no one of the millions of people, or billions even, writing online are not talking about this? So it's possible. But the other thing to keep in mind is that what is actually more approachable, more easy to do, is to find something that exists now that maybe does have some or even a lot of people writing about it, but you find a way to just do it even better. And effectively what you're doing there is you're starting a new curve. And so basically the question for you then becomes, can I either identify a new problem that people want solved with content, or can I just be that much better at solving an existing one? And so this is tied to that. And it's this concept of saturation that I think a lot of people misunderstand. So saturation people often view as just the sheer number of people in a particular industry or a particular space. But what I think is actually more appropriate, especially as it relates to content, is it's not the sheer number of people, but the likelihood that you can out-innovate them. So again, that you can either find a new curve or start your own curve. And so there's two things to keep in mind here. So the first is the ability to out-innovate. So let's imagine these circles are imaginary markets, right? And so in general, if you view saturation as just the number of people in a space, you would probably say this market is a more surefire way to win, or this is a more approachable market, versus this, which has double to triple the number of players in it. In reality, if within a market, and I have them labeled as green, yellow, and red as how well they are actually addressing the needs of people within that market. And in this case, it's actually better to enter a popular market if the people in that market are easier to out-innovate. Just to give a couple examples, so I'll talk about Costco more in a bit, but Costco entered a market that was extremely competitive, at least in terms of the number of players and how long those players had been around for. So, you're entering just general retail, but Costco found a way to differentiate. And similarly, Stripe entered an extremely competitive market, payments. But again, they found a way to be that much better. And that's why both of these companies are doing so incredibly well. And then the other thing you want to keep in mind is, this sounds obvious, but sometimes people overlook this, is you need to find something that people actually care about. And so sometimes people will look for markets, again, like this, where no one's there. And if you find that market and you really are such an innovator that you found something that others haven't found, sometimes that is incredible and that you get outsized returns for finding that. But what can very often happen is you found something that people don't actually want or is just too hard to solve. So there's a great quote that Paul Graham tweeted several months ago, but he basically said, you have an idea, you check whether that idea exists. It doesn't, good sign, right? Well, maybe not. Maybe you're the first to think of it. That's kind of like, we like to think of ourselves as smarter, more innovative, more creative than other people. But in reality, there's a lot of creative people out there. And so what he's saying is, maybe it's just an idea that people think of all the time. And the reason it doesn't exist is that it never works, right? And it can never work for many reasons. But the point here is, don't shy away from competitive industries as long as you think there's a way that you can out-innovate or be better than the people in that industry. All right, the third fundamental is this concept of the internet changing the way that we can reach people. So you have content, you put it online. If we go back to that example of us being in the 1950s. So if you were in the 1950s and you wanted to create content and you lived in, let's say, Dallas, you can only reach the people immediately around you in Dallas. And you have very, very select ways of doing that, right? You need to get in the Dallas Star. If you get in the Dallas Star, you can't even reach people in New York, right? You can only reach people in these very regimented ways. But the other thing to keep in mind there is, because those distribution mechanisms were so big, right? They serviced an entire city, let's say, they could only talk about very broad topics, right? Because they're trying to find what the average person would find interesting, or they're trying to hope that if they read a story, at least 50% of the people care about it. So they're never going to write about some very niche, story about microchips. But today, you now have the mechanisms, the communities, the search queries, the very targeted advertising channels that you can actually say, I could write about microchips, and there's actually a ton of people around the world, maybe not in Dallas, but around the world, who care about this. And I actually now have the ability to reach these people. So that's another fundamental that's really key to understand, is that the internet changed the way that we can reach people, and by nature that also changed what we now can write about and be effective with. And then finally, tied to the third principle, is that because the internet removed these barriers of you can only reach people in a specific area, you now have access to billions of people, technically, right? You're not going to reach all, 7 billion people on this earth. But because of that, what you now have is everyone competing in the same game, right? And so instead of before, if I lived in Toronto and my content wasn't as good as someone in Dallas, but it was the best in Toronto, I would still get eyeballs. Now, only the best stuff wins, right? And the best stuff wins in a disproportionate way, which means that, if I create an article, and even if it's pretty good, there's so much really good content out there that my pretty good thing is not going to get that many eyeballs. And so in most cases, the internet is an equalizer. In this particular aspect of things, it's not an equalizer. What it does is that just the stuff at the very top gets a complete disproportionate amount of page views and eyeballs and attention. And so that's why it's incredibly important. This sense of differentiating and being better is important, because if not, you end up, somewhere along here. The average article doesn't do you any justice. All right, so this is an example of a product, right? Not a newsletter or a publication, but I think that demonstrates what I'm saying very well. So Costco is a company that I think many of this call are familiar with. This is their stock chart from the last couple decades, and you can see they've just crushed it, and they've crushed it again in a very competitive industry. And one thing that I thought was funny is that I've been familiar with Costco for so long, I just view Costco as like a brand name, like Walmart. It doesn't mean anything. But even in their name, I realized this as I was creating the slide, cost is like first and foremost in their name, right? It's like front and center. It takes up 2/3 of their name. And so what Costco does incredibly well is they found one thing to do much better than everyone else. And in this case, it was cost. And you can see even in their mission statement, it's incredibly clear. You know, a lot of companies these days have very vague mission statements of changing the world. No, Costco's mission statement is to continually provide our members with quality goods and services at the lowest possible prices, right? And so this is a really key concept that people get wrong, is that people think, you know, I want to be high quality. I also want to be funny. I also want to be fast. I also want to be all these things. And if you can achieve all of that, that's great. But it's very hard to balance all of those things and do them all incredibly well. Now, people don't choose products or services or content based on the average of everything. They're not like, let me find, you know, a product that is decent cost and I kind of like the store and it's kind of nearby. They trade on one thing that they care about. And so you can imagine how, you know, there are many stores that are pretty good at all these things, but they have not, you know, their stock chart doesn't look like this. And so what Costco did incredibly well is they said, we're going to optimize everything for cost, something that people care about. So if you've ever been to a Costco store, I mean, they're hard to get to. I've never been helped in a Costco store by, you know, any employees. Their package sizes, you have to buy like, you know, massive, like an 8-pack of Q-tips that no one wants. Their stores are actually just like warehouses. So the ambiance is, you know, there's more to be desired there. The point is no one cares because, or at least the people who care about cost, the cohort of customers that Costco has recognized, they care about cost above all these things. And for that reason, Costco has been incredibly successful. So you need to find what your thing is, like your equivalent to cost at Costco. All right, so you need to be better at something. You can be funnier, you can be more concise, you can be more visual, you can, you know, target a specific group. You can do so many things. You know, there's more than just this list, but the point is that you need to be better at something. And so there was this Indie Hackers post a couple of weeks or months ago, I don't remember now, but it basically asked people why they, you know, what's your favorite newsletter and why? And another thing that people get wrong is people often think, okay, I'm going to win people over because I'm talking about a certain type of thing, right? Like I'm talking about business and tech, or I'm talking about these topics. But what people actually say when you tell a friend about something, you're not saying, hey, they wrote about business and tech this week. You're saying, oh, I love this newsletter because it's so funny, or it's so punchy, or it actually saves me so much time. And these are some snippets from that Indie Hackers post of people saying, hey, I really love X newsletter for these reasons. So it's short, it's high quality, it feels like a, you know, professional book writer wrote them, or, you know, snappy data visualization, so they're quick to read, even though they're still deep. So this is really important to understand because a lot of people think that just writing about certain topics will make them successful, but you need to find your differentiator. You need to be better at something. And so this is from a type form that I sent out to people who were attending these live sessions. And some of you might be on this call and have answered some of these, but this is from people who purchased the book. And I asked them, what is your favorite newsletter? And tell me why. And again, you're seeing the same thing as on the previous slide, where you have a couple examples where people are talking about what the actual newsletter talks about. But in most cases, they're talking about, you know, it's authentic, it's quality writing, organized, dense, focused. The one that came up the most across at least the responses, I mean, this sample size is tiny, but was James Clear's 3-2-1. And most people who wrote about it said pretty similar things, right? It's actionable and succinct, right? It's crisp, very direct, short, sharp. So basically, James Clear has recognized that there's a bunch of people who care about personal development who are busy. And so he has stood out, even though that segment or industry is extremely competitive, there's a lot of people in it. He's realized that if he can deliver great, short quotes, if you've ever read 3-2-1, it's mostly just quotes from books or things like that, that people would appreciate it. And clearly it's one of the biggest newsletters in the world. And, you know, people love it for that very simple reason. All right, so just to give a quick summary, actually, I forgot on this slide, I'd love to, if people have them, if you guys have your favorite newsletters, and you want to share them and why you think they're great. I have an example if people don't want to speak up, but I'd love to hear from the audience if you've got a favorite newsletter, or maybe one of the newsletters on here, and why you think it's so much better than whatever else exists in that industry. All right, no one wants to speak up. If not, I'll share mine.
I'll speak up.
Okay, perfect.
Because it's, a lot of this stuff feels techie to me, which is not really my thing. So mine comes from it's actually a woman named Susanna Conway. And the reason I like her life is literally normal. Like, she's not trying to create like a facade of like, look at my great life. Like, she literally will talk about her cat or, the fox that comes to visit in her backyard. But when her email comes, it comes like twice a month. It's just like a girlfriend, like sharing like, hey, this is what's been up with me. And it's not tied to that like hype mentality that I feel like a lot of things are, or the other one, which is like, do these 5 things to, you know what I mean? Like, all that stuff starts to feel exhausting for me. This is just her kind of sharing what's gone on with her for a couple of weeks and how she's thought about it maybe in certain ways. And so I actually find it refreshing in that sense. And I literally, like, if I haven't heard from her, I'm like, what the hell? Like, wait a minute, so it's slightly different to these, in that it's just very comforting and feels very relatable in a way that doesn't make me feel like, my God, I got to get my stuff together,
Yeah, totally. And I love that you use certain adjectives like comforting, relatable, authentic. Like, what you should be able to do with your publication or newsletter is you should be able to describe it with single adjectives, right? Like, I am more genuine than the other things out there. I am more succinct. I am more high quality. The things, again, that people normally gravitate to when they're trying to define their publication is they say, I'm going to write about X. And that's fine. You should definitely figure out what you're writing about. But what people often don't spend enough time thinking about is like, what am I going to do differently? How am I going to do this differently? And if you can't actually articulate that in a single adjective, or maybe a couple together, then I think that's where you're going to struggle, because you do need to differentiate. And again, when people tell other people about newsletters or what their favorite thing is, their favorite product is, they're not often talking about exactly what it is, but how it makes them feel, right? Or what it does for them. And so you need to be able to do that. And that's honestly a really good gut check, is trying to do that for your own publication. Or if you don't have one yet, do this exercise where you basically take your favorite publication and map it out to an adjective. That's one of, if you guys haven't had a chance, the exercise, there's like an exercise book attached to the actual book. And it guides you through doing some of these exercises, like mapping out publications to adjectives. And then you want to do the same thing with publications that you were once subscribed to, but you've now unsubscribed to. It was too long. It was too boring. It was too frequent. It was too infrequent. I no longer trusted the person, right? So think about what makes you subscribe to your favorite things and what makes you unsubscribe from things that you've now unsubscribed to, and try to parse it into as small of a thing, like a single adjective or a couple words as you can, and do that. If when you start your publication, you should be able to do that as well. All right, let's keep moving. So just to summarize the fundamentals part of this is really there's probably many more factors that have driven the way that content has changed over the last decade or two, but I think these 4 are really important, and they all kind of tie together. And the summary is really that, the internet has allowed so many more voices online, which is amazing. It's certainly a net positive, but if you are a content creator and your goal is to get attention, it does make it harder because so many other people are vying for that same attention. Now, what is good is that the internet has not just allowed us to get online, but it's allowed us to reach people in new ways. And if you're able to be better, right? So if you're able to find a differentiator, you can have these disproportionate returns, right? But if you're unable to find that differentiator, you end up in this kind of unfortunate zone. Even if you're pretty good, you lose out to the people who are amazing. So that's kind of the summary, and we'll jump into, okay, so those are the fundamentals. Now, how do I actually differentiate? How do I actually identify what I want to be writing about and how it can be different? And so if you already have a publication, or you already have an idea of how you're going to do this, this may not apply as much, but I think that it's a good exercise in general, in that if you're unsure how to differentiate, the best place to start is to think about what you are either really good at, or really a proxy for that is what you have just spent a lot of time on. And so a differentiator can be anything from a skill to maybe an experience, or even just an understanding of something that you've spent a lot of time thinking about, or a lot of time ruminating over, so that you have done that thing more than the average person. So there's this quote in the book that says basically anything that you've spent an above average time learning about can be translated into information that's going to be valuable to the average person. And something I call out here is this is the same for companies. And so if you're a company, think about, don't just write about, let's say, I'm trying to think of a company, let's say you're a tech company. Don't just write about general tech because you happen to be a tech company. What do you as a company know that other companies don't know? And you don't need to, necessarily share proprietary information, but if you are a payments company and you've worked in payments and you've recognized certain trends in the payment space because you've all these vendors, well, talk about the trends you're seeing there. Don't just talk about tech overall. And so the best way that I think, or maybe not the best, but a good way to visualize this is that imagine there's a spectrum, and on the left-hand side here is, representative of when you know nothing about a particular topic. And then the green is like, let's say you're the absolute best in the world. You know everything, or all there is to know about a particular topic. Now, something to keep in mind here is that it's very rare anyone is here, right? I'm not there with anything. But what you should keep in mind is, again, with this quote, is that no matter where you are on the spectrum, anyone to the left of you can get value out of what you've learned if you capture it in an effective way, right? So you can even be here and all these people can, get value from you. And so something that someone asked on the last live session is like, okay, when do I know when to start? And the answer that I gave is that you can actually start at any point. Just the further along that you are, the more likely that there's, a larger group of people that can benefit from you, right? And so what's important here is, again, you can start here if you have a skill and you're here and there's still some cohort of people, but what's also likely there is that there's going to be a lot more people ahead of you on the spectrum. So just take some time, not necessarily right now, but take some time to think about, like, what have I just spent a lot of time with? What am I better at than a significant portion of the world? And actually, I'm going to skip to this slide and jump back to the one before this. But in order for you to do that, you can just start asking yourself certain questions, right? You can just say, literally, what have I spent more time on than 95% of the population? What's something that, you wish existed 5 years ago before you went down and learned a bunch about marketing, or learned a bunch about payments, or whatever, or about life, that you would have loved to exist 5 years ago? What are things that you think about in the shower? What's just a unique insight that you think 99% of the population maybe hasn't come around to realize? Because again, you've just spent a lot of time thinking about it. So start with your obsessions and work backwards. Now, you don't necessarily need to write about your obsessions, but this is just the easiest way to find a differentiator if you haven't already identified one. We're going to go back to this slide. And, once you've done that, once you've thought about what you're very good at, there's this concept in Japanese called ikigai, which is this 4-circle matrix about kind of finding your calling, I guess you could say. And I just kind of repurposed that into this idea that when you're writing online, you can then take, this thing like your differentiator, what you're really good at, which is number 3, something you can contribute uniquely to. And then you want to map it and basically think about, okay, which of these things, because you're going to be good at multiple things, which of these things also doesn't quite exist online in its exact form. And this is important that it says exact form, because again, it's going to be rare that you see a particular topic that's not written about online, but is it written about online exactly how you'd write about it? Or can you do better? And then finally, when I say interesting, what I really mean by Is it something that people want, right? Is it, again, something that people are looking for, would find value in? And if you can find the intersection of these three things, so your differentiator doesn't exist in its exact form and it's useful to people, that's when your content will be in that like sliver of, you know, doing amazingly and reaping the disproportionate rewards. So just to give a couple super quick examples of my own journey. So when I started writing, there were years before that when I debated starting a blog, but honestly, I'm glad I didn't, because I wouldn't have actually really had a differentiator. I wouldn't have had anything that I had spent much more time on than the rest of the population. But by the time I did, it was because I had, you know, worked remotely for many years before others had. I had led a remote team. I'd really thought about the social dynamics there. I'd also taught myself to code in under a year. So all those things were, you know, not crazy special, but special enough that most people hadn't done it. And therefore all those people, again, I wasn't necessarily, if we go back here, I wasn't necessarily here, or even here maybe, but maybe here. And therefore all these people could benefit from what I had learned. And so again, people have done, you know, newsletters or publications about all types of stuff that they're very good at, whether it's they're great at Google Sheets, or they just are a huge Drake fan and they've spent way more time you know, working on that than other people. Medicinal marijuana. There's this one that I love, which is called Unnecessary Inventions, which is this guy who's crazy creative and has access to a 3D printer, which most people don't. And he just creates unnecessary inventions, and they're awesome. But yeah, just think about this intersection and where you can provide value to people. All right, so quick note on this. So when I talk about this, you know, finding your specialty or your differentiator, I'll sometimes use the word niche. And people, at least in this case, misunderstand what I mean by niche. And so there's different ways to use the term niche. But in this case, I'm not talking about niche topics necessarily. Now, you can write about niche topics, but what I'm talking about here is really niche positioning or niche value. So using that Costco example again, you can go into a very big market as long as you have niche positioning. In Costco's case, their positioning was their cost differentiator. And so when I say this, your niche is really your specialty, and specialty doesn't mean small. It can, but it doesn't need to mean small. The other things to keep in mind is that no one is monogamous with their content. And what that means is that, you know, if you go to a grocery store and you buy your groceries for the week, you're done for the week. You bought your groceries for the week, and you're not going to spend money on new groceries just because. But with content, if there's great stuff that's new, people will engage with that because they want to. So if you happen to be subscribed to 3 email newsletters about personal development, and there's an amazing 4th that you hear about, you'll subscribe to the 4th. And so as long as you're adding value to the world, you don't need to worry about newsletters or content being a zero-sum game. And then finally, you don't have to start niche. Like, you don't have to start super, super, super specific. But in doing this, it helps you actually nail down what you're really trying to achieve, helps you form a thesis, and it helps you, based on that thesis, get traction much more easily than if you have a super broad goal or broad, you know, positioning that you're trying to achieve. And just to give a couple examples of both companies and super successful content creators who have done this, is that, you know, they all started somewhere very specific. So Facebook initially was a hot or not app. Now, if you go into Facebook, it does everything from like groups to messaging to, I don't even know all the things. They now do VR, like all the things that Facebook does are far past what it started as a hot or not app. And you can see a couple other examples here of people who started very, you know, discreet and then expanded. And so as you're determining your positioning, similar to the exercise that I mentioned about using adjectives to understand your differentiator, you should basically be able to parse what you're trying to achieve into a single statement, which is basically like a what for who. And this is similar to a lot of startups will do this. They'll be able to say what they're actually trying to achieve in a sentence or less. And the reason that's important is because if you're unable to do that, similar to the adjective case, it probably means that you don't have enough clarity on what you're trying to actually achieve. And you're more so going at things from the perspective of what you want to do versus what people actually want. And so what I mean by that is, you know, I often hear people say, oh, I want to write about, you know, like maybe business and tech, but I also really love science. And, you know, I think I'll just start a weekly newsletter on that. Like, that's what my newsletter is about. And I'm like, well, that's what you want, right? But if you're really trying to grow and scale a newsletter, you should be able to parse what you want or what you're creating into something that people want. And that's what you're what for who. You're communicating your value proposition. And so here's a couple examples from, popular publications. So, Rad Reads is the Oprah for millennials. And it doesn't need to be as punchy as this. But the idea is that when someone hears that, they know what you're doing, right? They know what value you're serving. And I would also encourage you, once you've created this, you don't need to, but you can use this messaging on your site as well, so that when someone goes there, it's so much easier for them to understand that you're not just some other business tech newsletter, or you're not some other fashion newsletter. You are like the Wall Street Journal for millennials, right? Or your design training for developers. And so you'll notice that many of these things capture a person's different, or not a person's, a publication's differentiator as well, right? So just in understanding that it's the Wall Street Journal for millennials, a millennial can recognize oh, the Wall Street Journal, actually, it's really valuable, but it's kind of boring. So I have a sense that Morning Brew is going to be a little punchier, a little more interesting. Same thing for Refactoring UI. There's a lot of design training out there, but they've managed to basically capture this sense of, okay, design training is not really tailored for developers. So if you're a developer, this is going to be better for you. And so you, again, should be able to parse what you're doing into a single sentence. And it's kind of like a forcing function for you to get down to the core of what you're trying to achieve. And then finally, as you do that, the other kind of misstep that I see people do is that they don't understand who they're actually trying to reach. And that what for who helps you get there, helps you understand who you're trying to reach. And effectively, you're trying, especially if you're just starting out, you want to optimize for a very clear group of people and what I call your 100 true fans, right? Or just your true fans. I didn't coin this term. There was an original article, 1,000 true fans, then someone wrote 100 true fans, but a true fan is basically someone that benefits from your solution a disproportionate amount. And a lot of people actually, they don't enjoy doing this exercise of identifying their true fans because they'd like to believe that they would appeal to everyone or to a lot more people. And that's okay. You can appeal to a wider group than your true fans, and that often happens. But you want to identify your true fans so, again, you can really understand your value proposition and who that serves. And so you shouldn't just do it and say, oh, I'm targeting tech junkies, right? So that's a good start. But who are these people, right? So what are their demographics? Where do they work? What kind of stuff are they reading? What are your competitors? Are there other newsletters that serve the same group of people? What are the pain points that they face daily, not just with reading online, but just what problems do they face? What about weekly? What about monthly? So just understanding who these people are. And something to keep in mind here is you can have multiple audiences, but there should always be a primary audience. And so a good example of this is, let's say you're writing in a newsletter or a publication about entrepreneurship. So you might say, am I targeting the super experienced entrepreneur? Am I targeting a new entrepreneur? Am I targeting someone who maybe, works adjacent to entrepreneurship, but not, isn't fully in it? You should select one of those. But what I generally advise is not always true, but generally, tends to stick, is that you should target the people with the most specificity and the most expertise. And so what I mean by that is, if you, in that scenario, that hypothetical scenario, if you target seasoned entrepreneurs, you by nature of writing really good content for those seasoned entrepreneurs will bring in people who want to be like them, right? Or who work alongside them, to use that example. And so if you're unsure, again, not always, but it tends to be true that you should select a primary audience of people with the most expertise, so it almost dovetails into the other people who don't have as much expertise. And then the final thing, so here's an example, you can read through this, and I give another example in the book, but you should be able to create something like this for your 100 true fans. In this case, unlike the what for who sentence, this should actually be pretty elaborate, right? You should be really diving into who these people are. And then finally, it's just a simple question, which sometimes people overlook, is, okay, can you actually reach this person at scale? You understand who they are, but do I actually know how to reach them? Do I know where these people hang out? Do I actually think I have a distribution mechanism to reach these people? Yes or no? So just taking the time to think about that. And then I have a quick poll. So I have I think 2 or so more slides to go through. But before I do that, I just have a quick poll because we're mostly done going over the personal monopoly. Oh, I just realized oh, sorry. Fumbling around Zoom for a second. Here we go. Personal monopoly. Since we're finished talking about that, the question is, given what you've learned, either through this presentation or through reading the book, I think the poll should be live, yeah. How did learning about this change your view or your approach? Did it not change anything? Did it change like who you think you need to target? Did it change the way that you think you need to differentiate? So what are you better at? Did it make you feel like you needed to rethink multiple things? And for those of you who have answered, the poll should have popped up on your screens. But for those of you who answered and are willing to share, I'd love to know a little bit more about, if it did make you rethink things in some way, what did it make you rethink? And how are you now thinking about your personal monopoly?
Yeah, I'll go. So since the blog I'm kind of curating and putting together is for a company, I'm thinking about, who do I want that blog to serve? And we serve students, but really the parents are paying for the program that the students are enrolling in. And then we also have like college counselors, for instance, who are really invested in their students doing well. And so I've been thinking about, okay, like who should the blog really be for in this like triangle?
Yeah, so that one, it's funny, I had someone write in about something similar, this like parent-kid dynamic. In the case where the person wrote in, it was like more of like a younger child, so my advice might change between the two, but you want to think about, again, to give the example of the entrepreneurship, it's like, if I target one of these, will I by nature capture the other? This may not be true with a parent-child relationship, but can you tell me a little bit more about what kind of information you're actually writing about and what your goal with that information is?
Yeah, so right now it's very new, and currently our blogs are featuring students who have gone through our program and have done a great project and giving advice to other students, which seem to work well. The parents also really like them, but we're also thinking about doing content that's less about our students and just, capturing people who don't know about us at all, a little bit for SEO reasons, but also so people who are, let's say, interested in high school age learning just naturally come to us.
Yeah, so from the sounds of it, I would need to learn a little bit more to give like a definitive answer, but from the sounds of it, it's like if you were to ask this question, who benefits the most from your solution, even though the parent is potentially the decision maker, the person actually getting the most benefit from your content is the student, right? A parent is not going to subscribe to a newsletter, or likely won't, for something like this, right? And so if you target the person who really gets the most benefit, who understands this the most, I would probably target the student in this case. Again, this differs actually from the example where someone wrote into me last week where they were talking about selling toys, right? And in this case, they were talking about very young kids and parents. And in this case, it's like the interest actually lies with the parent, not just because they're the decision maker, but because they want to know what toys exist out there. They want to make their child's life better. And so you really, again, you just want to ask the question of like who actually benefits from this information the most in a disproportionate way. And at least from what you've shared, it sounds like the students in this case, that would be true for.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
No problem. Any other thoughts of people who are rethinking things or have questions about any of the things that we've gone over?
Yeah, can you guys hear me? This is John Walker. Okay, yeah, I don't have the video on because it's really dark where I am. So I'm basically starting, I have a podcast that I already started with a couple guests. It's centered around creative entrepreneurial parents and like what that's like on a day-to-day basis. And what you can learn from it. I actually don't have any kids, and so it's just something that I thought was really, really interesting because eventually I do want to have kids, but I also think that with a lot of problems we have in the world, better parenting may help those things. And so what I'm thinking about is how do I, as someone who doesn't have any kids, kind of create content that can be good for parents and people who eventually will want to be parents. So that's what this this your book has helped me kind of rethink and like how I'm going to go ahead and how I'm going to approach that and dig deeper into my whys of starting this and how I can target it towards people who may find this interesting. So my question for you would be, I think that I'm crossing creative entrepreneurship and parenting. Like, I don't want to ask you, is that something that you think would be interesting? It's a matter of how would you go about potentially, or how should I go about trying to find more of a target demographic for that?
Sure. I actually think that's an amazing idea. It's a pain point, right? So a lot of people, there's that saying where it's like, you should be a painkiller, not a vitamin. Like, that's something that a lot of parents want to be entrepreneurs or want to pursue entrepreneurship, but they don't know how, or they're limited in their time. And so I actually think that's an amazing idea. What I would say for you is, first go see what's out there to see if this exists to some extent or not. Again, if it does, find a differentiator. You can either differentiate by, just being better in a particular way, as I've talked about, by being funnier, by, being more clear, whatever. Or you can niche down and say, I'm actually targeting a particular type of entrepreneurship or a particular type of parent. But what I would do because, in some cases you are the demographic, in other cases you don't. You can build successful publications either way. But I would go and just, with this kind of 100 True Fans concept, go talk to at least, 5 to 10 parents that would be your target audience, and just try to understand their, the like very concrete problems they have. So they want to be an entrepreneur, but if you break that down, it's like, is it they don't have enough time and they don't know how to manage their time? Is it that they don't have the right ideas and they're not exposed to the right information? Is it that they actually do have ideas, they actually do probably have a little bit of time, but they don't have the right support community and they need that, right? And so there's different layers. And I think the best way, if you're not your target audience, is to go ask these questions, right? Ask them how they spend their day. Again, like, what pain points do they face daily, weekly, monthly? How much of their day do they have dedicate to this? Because this is a great example of where I think the way that you deliver content is going to be very important, because these people are super busy, right? So how do you deliver something super actionable for parents that don't have much time on their hands? And so what I would say to you is, just to summarize what I said, go figure out if something actually exists in this market. If it does, you find a way that you can be significantly better than it, either by niching down or finding your differentiator, right? Funnier, punchier, whatever. And then go talk to a bunch of busy parents that want to be entrepreneurs and figure out what are the concrete things that they need. And probably start with one, right? I named like 3 of them, but probably start with one. And then again, you can expand once you've gotten, a solid base. Does that help?
Yep, most definitely. I think I'm finding it a bit complicated just because I look at it like it's for creative entrepreneurial parents who probably already have children, and then people who are not parents yet, because I'm thinking majority of people are, maybe not everybody, but I feel like a lot of people are probably going to eventually be parents. So I'm thinking about it on both sides, the before being a parent and after, and I've been kind of challenged to think like, am I taking on too much by trying to think about both sides of the coin? But I will most definitely do those, and I appreciate those talking points.
No problem. And actually, what you just said is a great example of where, and I think a lot of publications should operate this way, where you can have multiple audiences, but you should have a primary one. And this kind of fits that mechanic that I was talking about before, with like the entrepreneur versus the aspiring entrepreneur versus the adjacent entrepreneur. And where in this case, you have people who have kids, don't have time, want to be entrepreneurs. Then you have people who, like me, want to have kids someday, recognize that I'll have much less time. But which one has a more acute pain point? And the answer is the parent who has kids right now, right? They have a very clear problem. They can understand your offering. And so I would target them. That's your primary audience. And then your secondary audience is people who either, are having kids in the future and recognize this, or you may even have like a tertiary audience of, if you end up writing about how people can more effectively spend their time and get in the right communities and all this stuff, that's really valuable for any creative entrepreneur, right? But their need is just less acute. So you may even have like a tertiary audience of just anyone that wants to improve or become an entrepreneur. But again, focus on the most precise audience that you can, that gets the most value from your content, orient around that, and you will naturally bring in people who are less, precise. But that's how I would think about it. And that also makes your job easier because you're not trying to tailor to multiple audiences. You're focusing on one. And yeah, that'd be my advice for you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And if anybody wants to listen, the podcast is called the Creative Parents Podcast.
Perfect. Like I said, I'm not a parent, but I think that's a really good idea. It's an idea. I've written a lot about things like productivity, and I very consistently get parents writing back to me sometimes very angry that, like, you don't know what it's like to have kids, and I don't have the time. And I think that's probably true. And so I think that's a wonderful idea for, a publication or a podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. Good luck on the rest of your presentation.
No problem. Any other questions at this point?
Yeah, there's one thing that you've sort of made me rethink. There's a piece of advice that I've seen mentioned quite often, which sort of goes against this a little bit, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. It's that you should sort of start just writing anything, and then you'll see what resonates, because you don't know that 95% where you spent more time, you're not necessarily aware what that is. So you should just put something out there first, and then have that help you define your audience. So I'm not sure how that fits into this.
Yeah, so I think it's a good point, and I've seen that mentioned a lot on the web as well. So I do think in general, you should get started before you think you're ready and all these things. And I also definitely agree with the point that you should use data, right, to influence your decisions, and you shouldn't just go based on your gut. But this is almost like, so what I like to say is that hopefully this book is like an accelerator or a shortcut for many people, right? It's not going to be the end all be all. You're not going to listen to everything in the book, but hopefully what it helps you do is save time from making specific mistakes, or even just it saves you a bit of time in the experimental phase. And so what I mean by this is basically what you can do is ignore all of this, not think about your personal monopoly, not think about any of this, and just go and write about whatever you want. And you may be successful, and many people have been successful with that approach. But what I'm saying is that you can actually hopefully shortcut this by asking yourself the right questions, thinking about who you're truly trying to target, and definitely still experimenting, right? Still trying to figure out, like, whatever you start with may not be the end of what you end up pursuing, but taking the time to think about what actually probably would have the highest likelihood of success, and starting there, and also thinking about where do I have an unfair advantage compared to most people online. I think that's really what I'm trying to communicate, because I do agree that, like, go out there, write about things. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just to go back to just super quickly, that graph, or not graph, the spectrum, right? So again, you can start here and write about things that you're not, that experienced with, and still find success within this group of people. And so that's why you can start whenever, you can write about whatever you want. But if you start here with a topic versus here with a topic, you're just more likely to succeed. So that's really, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thanks.
Cool. All right, any other questions before I go through the last couple slides?
This has been really helpful, because I'm in this interesting stage where I have a lot of the pieces of the puzzle kind of clear. I am my audience, so that kind of helps a little bit in that, it's the conversations I have with women my age. So that's kind of what's motivating it. I'm sorry, I got a lot of noise happening.
That's right okay. Now. You're all good.
Nothing I can do about it. I feel like the thing that's going to differentiate me is tone of voice. I'm not sure if that is a thing to differentiate, but what I find with women in my age group is they're very timid and set in their ways from living on the planet for 4 or 5 decades. And I'm very direct and not timid. And it seems to resonate when I interact with people. So that's what I want to incorporate into my newsletter. So I'm wondering if that, you think, this is the first question, if that's enough of a differentiator to begin with. I feel like you can also discover things as you start to do something, and like,
for sure,
kind of tell you. The second thing is, in my research, I literally cannot find anything of half decency around women in midlife. Like I found a couple of like groups, communities like on Facebook, which seems to be the main place that they hang out where they're somewhat active. But I'm not kidding. When I find like a blog or something, it is the most depressing thing I've ever seen in my life that I just want to kill myself for being in midlife.
Yeah.
And so then I get unsure if I'm like, okay, is it just because there's not, goes back to that thing, just because there's nothing there doesn't mean it's necessarily a place to discover, and be the innovator in the space. So I do get a little torn about that.
Sure. Yeah, so to answer your first question, voice alone is certainly enough to become a differentiator. So just as an example, the company I work for, The Hustle, I mean, they do other things very well, but the most consistent thing that people say is the differentiator is the voice. People think that, The Hustle's funnier, more entertaining, etc. And so that alone is enough. Now you need to make sure that that is something that your audience cares about for the particular topic you're writing about. But to just give an example, if someone is writing about, I'm trying to think of a good example. Okay, so if someone's writing like not a long form newsletter, but it's just sending links, right? Just like it, Hacker Newsletter is one that basically aggregates everything that trended on Hacker Newsletter or Hacker News the prior week. If you have a better voice for that, like no one really cares because they're just looking for the links, right? But if someone is actually interested in reading long form content, engaging with a person, then voice is absolutely enough to differentiate. And like you said, you can start with that and see if there's other ways that you want to differentiate. And then to touch on your second point, I think what you said actually is a great indicator that you should go into writing about that, because it sounds like it's extremely simple for you as your own demographic or your own target market to be better than what's out there. I can almost bet you that given what, the subject that you're writing about, a lot of people have recognized that there's a lot of, people in this age range that, will consume content and that they can monetize this content and make money off of this demographic. So they're going out and creating just a bunch of like really shitty content. And no one, or maybe not no one, but not many have actually spent the time to, do this effectively, create things that are high quality. And just to give you an example of, this was very similar with me, where 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, I had worked remotely for, several years. And I felt like this not only was just like a trend, but there was fundamental things that were really interesting, right? The psychology behind remote work, how that changes dynamics within teams. And every time I searched for things, right? As a leader of a remote team, I would search for things like, how do you actually build culture within remote teams? And I'd get these like super shitty listicles that were like, the stuff in the listicles would be like, could go on like one of those like super cheesy posters on a wall, right? And so I had the same reaction where, when I was talking about an industry not having anyone in it, what I'm talking about is like, there's no articles. You go online and you're like, why is there no articles about remote work, right? That's not the case, but that's what I'm talking about when there's nothing there. What you're talking about is when there's actually almost, remember the two circles, where there's a lot of people there. There's a lot of people creating content, but they're all these like red and yellow circles. And so that is actually one of the best indicators to me that you can go in and your differentiator on quality or voice would stand out way quicker than you think, because that's what happened with me in remote work. I would go online and there were so many articles about remote work. And just because I had taken the time to, write at a deeper level, a more interesting, more honest level, and from experience, then my articles like took off almost immediately. And so that was a long answer, but yes, voice is enough. And given what you've told me, I do think there's a lot of opportunity for you to stand out in that space.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
No problem. All right, we'll have time for additional questions. I'm going to quickly go through the last two, or I think there's around 2 slides. So just as a summary, so we went through most of just like the core information, but just as a summary, I want to remind people that, again, the barrier to entry to create content is so low that many people just do it because they can. And so that's okay. But what I would really emphasize or encourage people to do is just to continuously try to solve problems. If you're solving problems for people, you will be surprised at how much solving problems is tied to virality or your success online. And so in growth hacking, and also unfortunately with pandemics, there's this K factor. And this K factor basically talks about how things spread, how easily things spread, how quickly things spread. And depending on your K factor, you can launch something and it can, quickly die. A K factor of, less than 1 will die over time. K equals 1 is linear. And then K greater than 1 is, these viral examples where you publish something and it basically does the work for you. People go and share it. It goes viral, ends up in places that you didn't even expect. So that's the goal, right? Not every article is going to end up like that, but your most surefire way to get a viral article is to solve problems for people. And people generally think like, oh, viral articles tend to be unexpected articles. Sometimes that's true, but often it's you're solving micro problems for people. So for example, a lot of articles will trend because they take something that a lot of people have been thinking about and don't know how to really parse, and they simplify it, right? And they help people basically get from A to B as they're thinking about a particular topic. And so again, if you go and write online, please try to, and it sounds like kind of silly to say, but please try to add value with your content. And with both, I compare products and articles a lot or products and publications a lot because they're very similar in that you identify a problem that people need and you create a solution for it. And so with this K factor in mind, it operates similarly to a product in that, if you, create a bad product, you can be VC funded and spend millions and you can obtain users, but they'll churn and, it'll be very expensive and you'll lose a bunch of money. If you have a great product, it may require, a push with marketing, but your CPAs will be low, users will refer other users, etc. The same thing is true with an article. If you start with something amazing, let's start with the bad first. If you start with something bad, you can promote it. You can post it on every subreddit there is. You can post it on Hacker News. You can share it on Facebook. You can, optimize it for SEO. But if it's bad, if no one really needs this, or you're not solving a problem with, high quality content, then it doesn't matter. It's going to have a K factor of, super low and just die. Now, the opposite with a great article just means that, you may need to give it a push again, may require a little bit of promotion. But once it gets out there, it will do the work for you. It will be shared by a bunch of people. It will end up in places again that you didn't expect. And so really just keep this in mind. Everything that you create, try to identify what problem you're trying to solve with it before you actually create it. And just to summarize, there's one more kind of activity after this, but just to summarize what we talked about. So really to understand how you can differentiate, it's best to just start from understanding how the internet has shifted how content can be distributed. So it's redefined information sharing, both in terms of how easy it is to create, but also how easy it is to distribute to very niche groups, but also the entire world. And then the lower barriers to entry have resulted in content overload, which means that attention is not returned in a linear fashion. It's very disproportionate. But if you find a way to become the best at something, you reap the benefits of that disproportional nature of how attention is returned through the internet. And the easiest way, not the only way, but the easiest way to find that edge, that differentiator, is to identify your personal monopoly. And then once you've done that, you just need to take the time to really think about what you're trying to achieve, what's your value proposition, and try your best to parse it into a one-sentence structure of what for who. And then finally, tied to that, you should be able to very clearly articulate who your true fans are. Now, these aren't necessarily your only fans, but your true fans, your primary audience, and know how you're going to reach them. And then finally, as I talked about in the last slide, always write with the intention of solving problems, not just putting content online because you can put content online. So with that said, we have just a quick exercise. And so when I invited people to this live session, I also sent out a type form, or I had a link to a type form where I asked people, hey, can you basically tell me what your personal monopoly is, or if you're working on something, what it will be. And these were the responses. And I'd love for us to just, take a second. So I'll give you a minute to read this. But then after that, I'd love to hear from people on this call. Where do you see gaps? And give obviously thoughtful feedback, but none of these are perfect. And so I'd love to hear from people in the audience. Oh, I think this one actually could be better if they thought more about this, or maybe they need to make this more clear. So take a second to read through these, and then we'll regroup in a minute. All right, so I don't know if I'm a slow reader, but I don't know if everyone has had a chance to get through them. But yeah, I'd love to hear anyone's thoughts on, you don't need to comment on all of these, you can even just comment on one of them, where you think these can improve, or also, if you see one that you think is really well done, you can comment on that as well.
Yeah, I really like the third one, mostly because I'm a 20-something. I would say that I don't really see the dichotomy between personal growth and mass socializing, but I think right now there is a real need for how to maintain and develop strong relationships, especially within during these quarantine times. But I think that could spill nicely over into a post-pandemic world where how do you build stronger relationships with friends in your 20s versus mass socializing on social media.
Totally. I think it's a great topic. My feedback on this one would be, I think they did a good job of identifying 20-somethings, but it's the feedback I'd give them, at least to start, would be okay, which 20-somethings? 20-some, is it just, anyone consuming content on the web, anyone with a phone? So I think this one could probably get a little more specific, but I also agree that it's a much needed thing and would be a great place to start.
I really like the first one. I think the first one's got this potential, it's kind of random, but Monaco and Luxembourg, you can stack two countries together. I don't know, I'm not in wealth, but I'm interested to think that there's a very specific niche here that people wanting to maybe ship money out to Monaco. I don't know, rich people that want to get tax havens. I don't know, there's just something there. It seems more honest. He's struggling. Everyone else kind of seems like a robot's writing it. I like he's human. There's something about it, it's human. I don't know.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I think this is, again, I think people sometimes try to, there's two sides of the coin, right? So sometimes people avoid larger markets like business and tech because they think they're too competitive. I think as long as you find a differentiator, you can be fine there. Or sometimes people avoid things that are too small because they think it's too small. But in this case, it's the reason it works, even though it's small, is it's a very, as you're saying, a very discrete group of people, right? These people exist. He's not just talking about something that he thinks people would be interested in. It's there are wealth management, professionals in Monaco and Luxembourg. I don't think he'd choose it, or he or she, I should actually say, would choose it unless they actually know something specifically about this particular group of people. And I'm not sure, maybe there is information out there for this group of people, but I don't think it would be super competitive for him to approach.
But even if he wasn't the world's most, the best wealth manager, you can add cultural storytelling to Monaco. It's kind of sexy. You can instantly just create a whole world of stories around that, I'm thinking about the Riviera right now. I'm interesting. Just something interesting about that. While the rest, I can't paint a vivid picture of, the story of what I'm gonna experience,
Right. And I think the other thing here, so he's mentioning, or he or she is mentioning, they're struggling to find positioning. I think that's fair. And I actually think this is true across quite a few of these. in that, again, when I gave a couple of those examples, like the Wall Street Journal for millennials, like you got a sense of what the differentiator there was, right? So that like in the what for who, you weren't just getting exactly what for who, you were understanding like what their specialty was and how they were doing things differently. And so what I think some of these are missing, for example, is like, you know, if you're working in wealth management industry, maybe there's like a lot of boring newsletters or, you know, white papers and stuff like this that people just don't want to read through, even if they're, you know, in the industry. And so similar to what Morning Brew did, like this person, I'm not sure what they're aiming for, but one way to differentiate would be to, yeah, just like have more fun with it, be more concise, have a great voice with it. That's, as we talked about before, that in itself is enough of a differentiator if you do it well. And I think a lot of these are missing that. So for example, this one, intersection of tech, society, and business, sounds like it could be super interesting, but what are you doing to, you know, differentiate other people who are talking about tech, society, and business? How are you doing that differently? Maybe just the intersection itself is enough, but I think you still need to find a way to, you know, have an edge within that. So that's really, I think, the most consistent feedback that I would give to a lot of these is thinking about how they're doing things differently.
I've got a question on my
Sure.
decision. My tagline's "A story a day keeps the bullshit away," and my main topics that seem to come up were sex, drugs, and startups. Now that's a very like, you wouldn't normally hear those words together, but I see like there's like R-rated versions of stories that go on in all those worlds that, you know, you would go to a Tarantino film and you'd pay for that 2 hours to kind of get immersed in that grit and grotesque kind of experience. A part of me just wants to tell the stories of a very clean part of this world, but I'm finding it hard to find out where the people that would go pay to see a Tarantino film would also be interested in startups, for example. Do you kind of get that little niche there of,
Yeah,
wanting to touch? Like, I want to hear all the illegal, like all the naughty stories that go on in startup land potentially as well, you know?
totally. I think, so this doesn't always have to be true, but I think if you're struggling with this, I would go back to the advice where, like, at least at the beginning, it doesn't mean you always have to be niche, but figure out like what is like the most like clear extreme version of what I'm trying to do, because your audience will be most attracted to that. And so even though there might be amazing kind of like unexpected stories and startups that people may actually like, these people who like Tarantino films may like, they may not know that they would be interested in that, right? So if they get the, you know, a newsletter that has that as the title, they may be like, oh, I don't know, like, why did I subscribe to this? I thought I was getting some like pretty raw stuff. And so I would start, if you're struggling with that, with stuff that's like just clearly for your audience, right? Like where they recognize it's for them. And then as you build up your audience, you can expand, you know, in terms of the diversity of things that you write about. The way that I like to kind of like to use an analogy is writing online, especially with a newsletter where you have a direct connection with people, is like having a friendship, where whenever you start a friendship, you need some node to bond over, right? And so when you develop a friendship, it's either like a mutual friend, or you were at a particular meetup that you both, you know, about a topic that you both cared about, or whatever, right? And you bond over that thing, right? Like, oh, we're both developers, or we're both whatever. And at first, that's all you talk about, right? At first, that's what you bond over. But over time, you know, your friends you talk about anything with, right? So you have to build a relationship where there's trust and someone likes you. And then over time, you can completely expand, and they can see all the like diverse parts of you that are still you, right? But it's really easy to build relationships if like over common ground. And so the easiest way to do that with writing is to identify like the most explicit common ground, right, that you have with your audience, and then expand from there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Cool. We can either, if anyone has any thoughts on the rest of these, or if you guys have any remaining questions, happy to answer them. If not, we can wrap this up, because I think this was just a reminder that I mentioned some of them in this talk, but if you haven't had a chance, I think the exercises can actually be super valuable, particularly for this section in thinking through some of the things that we talked about. If you haven't and want to join the chat, it's just a Telegram chat for now to engage with other people who are reading the book. And then we already went through the Q&A. So happy to continue answering questions if anyone has them, but if not, we can close this off and call it a day, night, morning, depending on where you are. So I'll assume, since no one's spoken up, that's it. So thanks so much again for everyone who is on this because you already bought the book, but also for joining this, and hope to see you all next week. I'll be sending out the invites for each talk on Mondays from now on. Sorry for the confusion for those of you who had to deal with that this week. But yes, from now on, invites will be sent out on Mondays, and the sessions will be Thursdays and Fridays. So yeah, thanks again, and hopefully see you all in one of the future sessions. Bye.